Do your end users always, and I mean always without exception, work on company-owned devices and IT-approved apps? I didn't think so. So my next question is, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question: Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign-in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. Check it out at securityweekly.com/1Password. That's the number 1 password. ThreatLocker implements a least privileged approach to cybersecurity, blocking every executable unless specifically authorized by your team. This methodology mitigates ransomware, supply chain attacks, and zero-day exploits, and ensures 24/7, 365 protection for your organization. To learn more about how ThreatLocker can help prevent known and unknown threats in your digital environment, safeguard your data and operations from threat actors, and align your organization with respected compliance frameworks, visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker. Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Ben Carr, Jeff Pollard, and Jess Burn. All right, let's get into segment 2 of this interview segment. And where I want to start this is kind of where we're heading right at the end of the last segment. Jeff, you were talking about what people are looking for in each of the roles. And what I want to do is I want to go through kind of the alignment of the different CISO types, because you said looking at a job description, you can pretty quickly figure out what type of CISO they're looking for to kind of already identify, like, yeah, is this a fit for me? Am I the right fit, etc. So talk through a little bit, like, from the different roles that you see and all the research that you guys done, what are the differences in experience, skill set, etc. in these roles?
Yeah, absolutely. And it does vary pretty distinctly between the different types out there. So first and foremost, one of the things that you can notice about this right away is that the level of management experience necessary for each of the roles definitely takes a little bit of a dip in sort of 2 to 3 of them. Operational, compliance and risk, and even steady state want a lot less management experience, which kind of makes sense, right? Operational, kind of often a first-time CISO, so you've had some management experience, but not as much. Pretty much all of them want fairly deep domain experience or industry experience out there. But if you're seeing a role that's looking for, say, 5 years of management experience versus, say, a decade, then you might be looking at operational, compliance or risk or steady state versus customer facing or transformational, which transformational generally wants about the most management experience as well. Again, checks out based on our types, because with that transformation, you're generally a member of the C-suite, right? So you need a lot more management experience, and really you need senior management experience, right? Not just managing sort of managers and directors, but you have a lot more experience than that kind of on top of it. And then also when it comes to education, bachelor's, master's versus just certifications required out there, we find that a lot of these are kind of broken out in a little bit more of a distinct pattern. Interestingly enough, operational CISOs required the most mention of a bachelor's degree. Now, almost all of these want a bachelor's degree, but they mentioned it most often. Although a master's degree kind of sits a little bit lower down there. Compliance and risk expert is sort of the top category for a master's degree. About 42% of those job listings mentioned that specifically as a requirement out there. So it does kind of vary a little bit. But again, if you're looking for that first-time CISO role and you're more operational, making sure you have the bachelor's, even a master's, is going to help you land that, whereas it becomes less important once you've had a few of those gigs. So that's kind of the baseline set, but then we can go into the individual competencies and responsibilities where there's a lot more variation.
Yeah, and I do want to go there, but I raised this point this way for a reason, is because Ben, as you got into the space, some of the education requirements, right, around some of these roles have been a really interesting topic of discussion. Like, do I need a bachelor's? Don't I need do I need this kind of stuff? I mean, your trajectory is really unique, I think, in that, how you came in to be a CISO and now where you are now, that, you had to deal with some of that, I think.
I did. I think, when I got into the the job role, there was originally, I think there was a bias towards education in some ways, right? It was kind of a standard at the time, like we're all of that age, I think, where like you kind of had to have it was assumed you had to have a bachelor's, right, to get a professional role. However, in security, it was one of those weird, unique fields where you could have a bachelor's, but it would be in, computer science, like programming. It would be in, and not even really data science at that point, right? You might have had a database course, but it wasn't really related. And so a lot of people got into the field because they had deep knowledge of the security and IT functions, but there weren't degrees for it yet. Now we're starting to see that, and I think we're starting to see more people be encouraged to go that way. Yet in my mind, it's almost with the prevalence of information access, I don't know if it's as required. Now, I do think from the management side, like if you're going to get a master's and you're going to go get some business experience, I think that's super helpful as you go up the stack. But it's still this weird. Yeah, I mean, I was going to comment, Jeff, that a lot of the successful CISOs I know, some of the guys in the investment side didn't get into this with degrees, right, or got them late in the career. So it is a weird space, I think, for that.
The other thing that I find refreshing to see is that the certification requirements are all under 50%, across all of these CISO types, because really at this point, the value should really be placed on experience, and the experience specifically that each type brings to the table, right? It has very little to do with
roles
with
less
a lot
and less
of the
technical, right?
degrees and certifications, right? It's everything about what you're bringing from your past experience as a security leader. So again, really happy to see that. I won't get on my soapbox about that for this one.
There's not a great certification for CISOs. Like
No.
I think
there
there's
really
a
is.
professional
There really
association that CISOs is trying to start up. I've done some work with those guys, but yeah, there's nothing out there that's really like, it's not like you're a lawyer or you're finance, you have a CPA or something, like you don't need it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
to your and one other thing to stress there too is that there have been a lot of these sort of executive education courses that have popped up that are very expensive, and they sort of promise that they'll help you get access to the C-suite or help you obtain that role. And we generally tell CISOs, look, if you had a technical bachelor's degree or even a liberal arts bachelor's degree, like you've been, I got my bachelor's degree when I was 35. So I was working in security for 15 years before that happened. I got into this because I knew some IT stuff, and then eventually knew some security stuff. But be wary of those as well, because as Jess often cites, the sort of education industrial complex is real. And even those sort of professional certifications can sometimes be a little bit of a money grab that may not get you the access. If you want to learn fundamentals of business, because maybe your degree didn't teach you that, then it might be something like an MBA or some sort of master's degree like that. Makes sense, but beware of some of those professional certification courses that are associated with universities. They may not give you exactly what you want them to.
And I would lean into finding a great mentor, right? Like,
Yes,
and it doesn't have to be in security. Find a guy on the finance side or the legal side who's really good and willing to take you on as a mentee. And then, if you invest in that relationship, that'll pay huge dividends to the rest of your career.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a great segue into the skills people are looking for, because they vary, right? And you talked about, the degree side from an operational perspective, also more technical kind of skill sets in that role versus others. Like there is a big variation of like, what skills are you looking for in each of these different CISO types?
Yeah. And so one of the first things, and again, I mentioned as we looked at these, it was almost like the first couple of bullets, by the end, we could kind of tell immediately what that role was looking for, so to speak. So we broke this out across all the job types that we looked at, and then we kind of tagged each one of them and categorized them. So, first and foremost, when it comes to the sort of transformational CISO role, they're going to be talking about security management frameworks. They're going to mention things like security architecture, but they're also going to emphasize business knowledge and legal knowledge at an extent that others don't quite rank up to. So they're going to have that mix, and things like technology, IT security technology, et cetera. Those are pretty much going to be missing. If they're on the list, they're going to be way, way down the list versus, say, an operational CISO job posting. If one of the first things they mention are IT security technologies, and then, by the way, they proceed to list out the names of those technologies, which often happens, that's an operational CISO gig, right? That the reason why technology is right there and those technologies are identified is because they want to bring in a leader that is still very, very close to the technology. And as an opposite of that, things like legal and regulatory knowledge are almost absent in an operational CISO job rank. So if you see this and they mention technology right away and they don't bring up legal, they don't bring up regulatory knowledge, that should further cement that that's the kind of role they're looking for. Compliance and risk, they're often going to lean into the vertical itself, because obviously most regulatory issues are related to verticals. And they're also going to mention things like risk analysis, privacy, and other regulatory frameworks out there. Those are going to be what they lean into, right? They're really going to be forthright with that as kind of the key components, whereas steady state kind of mixes a little bit of legal and regulatory knowledge, but also security architecture and business knowledge. So it kind of pulls those things together. Interestingly enough, customer facing doesn't really dominate any of these categories, right? And so what you find with customer facing is that it's much more about product security, which doesn't show up in a lot of other listings. In fact, if something says product security, you can generally right away go that is a customer facing CISO. That's kind of the immediate sort of the immediate example of a customer facing CISO.
So I've got a follow-on question for this, and I'm not sure if you're going to say, no way to answer this. One of the things I've seen is that job descriptions, especially in the security side, are poorly written in general, right? And it's like a cut and paste from a lot of stuff. And I wonder how this connects, especially as you get to the CISO level, and the role is less and less understood, right? The higher up you go, I think, and especially for companies that maybe haven't had a CISO before and are trying to put something together, maybe haven't gone through like a niche recruiter who specializes in this.
Right.
The JD not matching up with actually what's successful in this role. Like, any assessment of that? Because I'm assuming you're looking at it was 100 job descriptions. I'm assuming they're public. I'm just wondering, if you have any thoughts on that, just people asking for stuff that is not needed or doesn't make sense or just really doesn't align with the 5 successful guys who have been doing it for a long time and seem to be rocking out the transformational CISO role. So what are your thoughts? It's a hard question, but what are your thoughts?
I think possibly, and this is, a little bit speculation, that, the less mature companies are going it on their own and putting out their job descriptions without any help from an executive search firm. I think if you're really serious about finding a customer facing post breach, especially post breach, because you're going to want to keep that on the DL maybe a little bit. You're not going to want to advertise that. We didn't see a job posting that said recently breached company looking for someone to help us clean up. That was not
with
fair.
SEC rules.
Yeah,
it's true.
Please help, apply here. But executive search firms are going to be able to smooth out some of that and actually ask the questions of the hiring, executives to say, what really are you looking for? Because they will have experience in finding that right people, and they have a network that they're going to go look for the exact type, right? So I think maybe less mature organizations who are really looking for, operational. I will say, of all the 100 job descriptions, the most requested type based on our manually tagging it and looking at all of these job descriptions was compliance risk. And I think that says a lot too.
That
right?
does, yeah.
We've had some recently fined companies seeking new, CISO is basically what it looks like. We want to not get in this hot water again. And we're looking for somebody that really understands the regulations that apply to the industry in which we
That's
operate.
not surprising, but unfortunate. It's disappointing. It makes me cry a bit inside.
It does, because we've talked about this so long about, compliance and the checkbox mentality not being the right way to address security necessarily holistically, but yet that's what we're hiring for.
Well, we're also in this era of regulatory FOMO, where if you're a compliance entity, if you're a cabinet level agency, if you're a sub-agency of a cabinet, if you're a sub-agency of a sub-agency of a cabinet, if you've got a friend that works in the government, then you've come out with a security framework of some sort that you're pressing onto an industry of some variety, whether it's regional, whether it's vertical. So in this era where everyone wants their own special regulation that none of them interrelate to the other regs that already exist, then I think that's part of the reason why companies are looking more at those kinds of roles, because they're getting hit on all sides with these regulatory frameworks that aren't cross-mapped to each other. And so they need someone that's been through that. And that's why I think we do see so much of that, because really every industry is now so heavily regulated that you really need someone, or often feel like you need someone that has those experiences. Now, Betty, your question about kind of one of the ways to sort of suss this out. The other thing we did is we didn't look at just, the sort of the things the job rec listed, but other those, the conversational cues that you can have during the discussion itself, right? I'll give you an example. If you're auditioning for that CISO role, you're in the interview process, and you don't get a lot of leeway or information about the budget allocation process, right? if you're going in for a transformational role, that's absolutely going to be something you have, right? You're going to have full authority for the budget. That's going to be something you sit down and discuss with CEO and CFO as kind of final arbiters. If you're in an operational CISO role, you're getting your budget approved by the CIO because that's who you report to. So if budget allocation isn't a big part of those conversations that you're having, well, that should give you a clue. The job rec might have said transformational, but if you don't understand who has final authority of your budget, or you hear CIO has final authority, we've got him, right? That's potentially a red flag of, you're telling me you want transformational, but you're telling me that my boss is the CIO and I'm part of the IT budget. That's not how a transformational CISO looks. That's not how a transformational CISO is successful in an enterprise where they're in the right role and all expectations are aligned. So looking at things like budget allocation, purchase authority, risk management responsibility, governance, et cetera, who's going to drive all of those things, that becomes a really important part. Another one, talking about metrics. We find that often operational CISOs and steady state CISOs have a lot less control over the metrics they're judged by, whereas transformational, that's one of the questions you're going to be asked about is, hey, how do you judge a security program successfully? If you're transformational, we want to know how you're going to do that to align with the business. If you're operational or steady state, we have some metrics we want to know if you're going to do the same. Exactly. Yes. Bingo.
So this is a interesting conversation. Can I suggest your next research? Can you go through and classify all the public companies and tell me what kind of CISO they have?
Oh my God, probably could.
Because here's why. I mean, this is gold. Like if you're on the other side, right? I'm going to put on my vendor hat for a second. Like,
sure.
If you understand the CISO type you're talking to, how you communicate, how you sell to them. Would completely change, by the way, right? Like I'm just sitting here in my own day life going, oh my gosh, if I would have known that, then I would do this instead of this, right? Because to your point, if I'm trying to drive a feature that is very metrics driven and you don't have control over your metrics, you're not going to care.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah. And by the way, so things like customer fee, or I should say transformational as an example, one of the things we have found, and this is a little bit of anecdata, so we've kind of sussed it out, but one of the things we find is that transformational, for example, is often a CISO that is much more willing to work with earlier stage vendors. They tend to be rebuilding a program. They're often working in technology companies, so they're more willing to go with a smaller vendor that might be more agile, where they can dictate things like roadmap. Whereas steady state is often going to be a security leader that's probably bound a bit by the large platform vendors, right? They're going to be that traditional sort of shop where if they run your productivity suite and they run your cloud, and that's who IT uses, that's probably who's doing your email security and probably who's doing your endpoint. So we do find some absolute distinctions there where, again, through anecdata and having our research in other areas, because Jess and I are also looking at security platforms, we find that a transformational leader much more willing to go with a smaller startup, whereas steady state probably going to be bound by the IT purchasing patterns and who IT has relationships with.
Yeah.
It makes a big difference.
Yeah, it does. And I can just see why Microsoft's so successful throwing out E5s to steady state and operational CISOs.
Sure. Yeah.
Done.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's in there, right? Like I don't have to worry about it. Yeah.
We already paid for. I believe we talked about this.
I know we did. And that's why I brought it up, because I'm like, you could almost classify the CISO type by company, knowing what they're looking for, which would be like we'd have to license all the data because it would be such a huge sales tool. Anyways, all right. So differences in skill sets, knowledge, etc. Let's say that, look, I think people that have been in the role for a while know whether they want to stay in the role or not in the role. New people coming in aren't quite sure. I want to cover the exit strategy for a CISO. Whether you're in the role, aspiring to be the role, want to get out of the role, there's a great section at the end of this report that I want to spend some time on, which is, what if none of this aligns to what you want to do anymore? What do I do? Where do I go?
There are a number of different avenues you can pursue for this. It really depends on, again, what stage in life you're at too, right? Are you ready to go into retirement? One of the things that I've seen a lot of CISOs do, and I'll bring this one up because it's the most related to being a CISO, is becoming a virtual CISO, right? A fractional CISO. I know lots of CISOs who retired, some of them forced by their family, actually, you've got to cut down, the number of hours that you work a week. And this is a soft retirement, right? It's a soft launch of going to do all the other things besides working. So you can become a fractional CISO. You can work with either partnerships that have, already have some benefits associated with that. So you can go it alone and hang out your own shingle. And I've known former CISOs that have been very successful, who have gone back into full-time roles and said, no, I'm going to go back to fractional. I like it. I like it more. I get to travel. I get to work with specific industries. And if you have some expertise, you can bring that program forward. You can actually mature it and then hand it off to a steady state type person who's already in that organization to continue to run it, right? You may be the first person to actually put together a program. So probably for smaller enterprises. And there are other options from there, right? I mean, there is becoming a CIO. Maybe you've decided, I got to get out of this liability circus right now, and I'm going to go back to becoming a CIO and focus on digital transformation, right? And just have a CISO report to me, or have them be a peer of mine, and focus on that. Maybe I've come from IT and I want to get back to my roots. And there are a few others. Jeff, I don't know if you want to talk about founder.
Yeah, I think the becoming a CIO, that's where we have to quote Chris Nolan, every hero that lives long enough eventually becomes the villain. So that's the CISO that becomes a CIO. And we partly joking, given some of what Jess and I hear about CISO and CIO relationships, it's kind of like I became the enemy, so to speak. I think the other ones are a little bit more conventional in recent years. I think one of the things I love to see CISOs go and do is start their own thing. I love CISO founders or former CISO founders. And I love them because, one, they've lived security problems for a long time, so they understand their customers, right? Which is just so hard for some security vendors to wrap their arms around. They don't always understand their customer, but CISOs do. So I think when you've built something that solved your problems, or when you know that problem space, being that CEO founder is that next step, is a really, really compelling situation. And I know for Jess and I, we talk to vendors a lot. And when we talk to some, to a former CISO that's now a founder in some variety, again, like you can tell, like they've lived the mission. And so it just comes across that they really understand where they're going and what they're trying to do. So I like that one. Also, of course, there's a lot of CISOs that exit to vendor world. They've got a vendor they work with, they've worked with extensively, they believe in them. And so they go and they take that field CISO gig, or maybe that sort of evangelist gig, where they're now working on behalf of that vendor, and can now sort of evangelize that solution for them. I think that's a terrific way to do it. Of course, given the leadership challenges out there, there's always kind of the book circuit and the speaking circuit of, sort of advising on leadership and how to help people become better leaders, especially security people. Become better leaders. So those are the other things we see.
One of my favorite, which was Investor, where you pointed out the easiest path, which was have substantial liquid wealth you can afford to lose.
Well, see, so I'm with you, Ben. Here's how. So what you got to do the CEO founder part, and then because even CEOs have a boss, it's the board and the investors. So you do the founder thing. You're lucky with that a couple times, right? You're successful. Then you get to go be the money person, right? And that's when you get to.
Or I've seen, like, if you're the CISO for an early stage startup that happens to go public or make a lot of money on the stock side, right? I've seen.
Then you can absolutely do it.
Well, and you're wanted at PE firms too, right? Like this is, you don't have to necessarily have your own liquid wealth, right? You could be very, very valuable.
That's the best way. Play with someone else's PE firm,
right?
Oh, it's always better.
And advise them.
Money's always better.
Yeah, on what's viable. So I mean, I think that's really important too. And to Jeff's points about having to serve as a CEO, that's really one of the only ways we're seeing CISOs actually serve on boards now too, right?
That was my question. That was my next follow-up. Was like, so you list out boards here, and I think that's an aspirational goal for a lot of people. It's for myself as well, but like you got to be in the club to be part of the club, which is a little bit frustrating for a lot of people.
Well, I think Jess, you pointed it out. If you have not run a P&L, you're not going to sit on a board, because it is about dollars and cents, folks, at the board, because it's all about the finances, right?
Yeah.
Right. And again, if you've not been the CISO type that has been even close to, running your own P&L, if you've been one of those other types, probably not. If you are a customer facing transformational, you're much more well versed in this. Then you go and get another gig, maybe as a founder, CEO, running a P&L in vendor land. And then you can probably serve on corporate boards, because as much as they want cybersecurity knowledge, it's not something that's going to actually make or break a decision about serving on a corporate board, because there's money involved with that as well.
And Jess and I did a big interview project last year where we talked to a lot of the large headhunting firms and the headhunters out there that are placing candidates on boards as well as in CISO, CIO, and other tech roles. And that was the number one thing that we heard. A lot of CISOs thought that with the SEC requirements passing, that they were going to get that board level job, right? And aspirationally, totally understand that. What we heard consistently is that the reason why they weren't getting that role is what you said, Matt. It's the fact that they didn't own a P&L. And at the end of the day, what is more valuable in a board seat, because you're going to get a fairly substantial salary to do quarterly meetings, right? Maybe more frequently than that. You're also going to get equity, is that you've got to know how a business runs and operates, because at the end of the day, your job is to help that business grow. And if you don't have that experience, it makes you a less appealing candidate across the board. So you're already starting, Ben, to your point of probably not having the network that other candidates have. And then you couple that with the fact that you haven't run a line of business, you haven't been responsible for a P&L and proven that you can make a business grow. And now you've got two factors against you. And that's why all of a sudden that CIO that you reported to for a decade is getting that board seat because they're a cybersecurity expert and you're not, because they're justifying that by the fact that you reported into them, but they were part of that. And so we see that pretty consistently. And even look at, take someone like, Kevin Mandia, who's serving on a lot of boards. He's now an investor. Yeah. How did he get there? It wasn't because of his Air Force experience in IR. It was because he ran Mandia and then Firefly. And that's what got him to where he is now. So I think that's where a lot of CISOs, if that's your long-term plan, you've got to think about how you're going to get there, and that founder exit or going to a vendor and running a P&L, maybe a consulting P&L, for example, might be one of the best ways to get there.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's what was really, really interesting, Ben, because you and I have had this conversation about, how do you get board seats? Well, if you're a CISO, you got to go start a company, basically become a founder, run a business, show that you can run a business. Then you get an opportunity to go sit on boards. And it doesn't really happen any other way. Now, you could also go be an investor from that path. So what I found interesting in this data set was, if you want to be on the investment side, you want to be on the board side, you almost have to go be a founder, which is interesting. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Jeff, Jess, thank you. Awesome data. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, well, it's always a blast.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.